Well, I hope you're still thinking about that question that I asked here a few minutes ago. Who in your life has hidden gifts? I have another question that I want to ask you, and you're probably not going to get the meaning of it right away, not for this moment at this time, but trust me, we'll get there. Here's my question. How long will you mourn for Saul, since God has rejected him as king over Israel? If you wanted to, you could pretty easily make the argument that the Bible is the story of 5 people. 5 people, their families, and their legacies. Abraham and Moses defined what it means to be a community of faithful people living under God. Jesus and Paul expanded the boundaries of that community to include all the people of the earth and ensured that the promises offered within that community would last for all eternity. Who bridges the gap? I've only mentioned 4. There's a 5th one there. The 5th figure that I've left out so far is David, because David is the bridge between Paul and Abraham, Jesus and Moses. Amongst the people founded by Abraham and by Moses, David sets the standards for Israelite greatness. His greatness becomes the metaphor the Gospels will repeatedly use to explain Jesus' power, his authority, his mission, and his identity. Now, Jesus is obviously greater than David. That's not surprising for me to say. But the Gospels make it plain that the best way to understand who Jesus is to see David as his earthly metaphor. You cannot understand Jesus if you do not understand David. That's a strange way for me to begin a sermon, given that our passage begins with discussions of a different king. How long will you mourn for Saul, God asks Samuel, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Saul, and not David, was the first king of Israel. David may have been the greatest, but Saul was the first. Saul ruled Israel in a time of chaos and uncertainty and internal strife and internal warfare. Saul settled that chaos. He led Israel on a string of military victories in the region. He earned the right. He built the resume that would indicate that he is a great king who deserves to be remembered by us in his own right. Sadly, all of Saul's success went to his head. He turned away from God. He rejected the authority of God's prophet, a man named Samuel. God, in turn, rejected Saul and sent Samuel out into the Israelite countryside to find a new king, one who would be faithful to God, one who would rule with justice and with mercy. So we have to ask another question then. Who is Samuel? Who is this guy? Who is this man who, when we meet him today, arrives on the outskirts of a small town carrying with him a horn of oil and a mournful and a fearful heart? Samuel was a prophet, a man appointed by God to speak for God to the Israelites and eventually to speak for God to Saul. Samuel had known Saul for years. The two had worked closely together. Saul had relied upon Samuel for guidance. Samuel had stood next to his God-appointed king through successes and through failures, through highs and through lows, through peaks and through valleys. And before all that, Samuel is the earthly figure who actually crowned Saul, who actually made him a king. The two have been joined at the hip together for years, their destinies intertwined, their lives knit together. How long will you mourn for Saul, God asked Samuel, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Misdeeds have consequences, after all. Faithlessness is noticed. This question is asked by God. But behind the question reflects the hurt and the disappointment that Samuel must have felt watching Saul, the man whom he loved, the man whom he believed in, the one in whom so much hope had been placed, not just by him, but by the entire community, turn away from God. Samuel mourns for legitimate reasons. Samuel feels deep grief at Saul's failure. And as God's question indicates, God is not very sympathetic about all this. God seems to be saying to Samuel, you made your life with Saul. You made your bargain with him. You spent your time with him, but now that time is over. That part of your life is over. That chapter in your story has come to a conclusion. And do you know what you need to do? You, Samuel, you need to get over it already. How long will you mourn? How much longer do I have to wait? How much longer do we have to wait for all this to resolve? Doesn't God seem a little bit insensitive here? Just a little bit, maybe? A little bit judgmental? A little bit unkind? Or is God telling Samuel, and perhaps telling us, exactly what we need to hear? You see, like Samuel, we live in a strange time, a time of rapid change, a time of upheaval. And we can certainly understand, I think, Samuel's desire to look back at the past and think about how great things used to be. To look back at the past and think, man, I wish the past was present. I wish that that's what our life was like now. Samuel could turn to the examples of Abraham and Moses and Joshua and look and see clearly what a good leader looked like, what a good God-fearing, God-loving, God-chosen leader looked like. He could see evidence in their stories that Israel was once led by faithful and steadfast and morally sound men. He could look to the memories of Saul's earlier reign, before Saul had rejected God and before God had rejected Saul, and he could find plenty of evidence that things used to be good and that they didn't have to end up this way. This didn't have to be how things turned out. The past was so great. How could this happen? That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Sounds familiar to me at any rate. I think these days we live in an age of regret, an age in which we look back at the past and we miss it, and we yearn for it, and we wish that the past would be present again. Many of us, myself included from time to time, spend our days thinking back longingly to a time when something was better, when the world was easier, when things were simpler, when life was easier, when people were more friendly and more kind and more God-fearing, and this world just seemed safer. We can understand Samuel. We can understand Samuel because Samuel is us. So how long will you mourn for Saul? God asks Samuel, since I have rejected him as king over Israel. These words are God's reminder to Samuel that he is not meant to live in the past, fixated on bygone glory, nor is he meant to live in a fantasy world, a world dominated by what might have been, a world in which Saul never went bad but continued to reign justly until his death. The good old days, the things that might have been, will always be appealing. It's always nice to live in that world. But really, most of the time, the good old days are a fantasy. a series of half-remembered events that were never quite as good as we recall them being. And in any case, the only reality that we are guaranteed, the only reality that we for certain have, is right here, right now, in this moment, in the present today. God isn't calling Samuel to forget about the past, but God is telling Samuel that he is needed here. He is needed now. He is needed in this reality. He is needed to be here, where he is. God needs Samuel to be fully present where he is in this moment, at this time, at this place, right here, right now. And God needs us to do the same thing, to focus our hearts and our lives on what is happening right here, right now. And God needs Samuel to do all this because today God has some work for Samuel to do. God leads Samuel into a village named Bethlehem. It's tiny and out of the way. We don't know much about Bethlehem or the surrounding environs, but I think we can say with certainty that at one point, Bethlehem was a great job producer. Did you know that? Bethlehem employed thousands of people to work in good, well-paying, salaried jobs at factories like DuPont and Bassett Furniture. Did you know that Bethlehem used to be full of young families, and all the churches in Bethlehem had big youth groups and big children's programs, and all the churches had 4 or 5 pastors and 6 or 7 different children's directors and 18 or 25 different choir directors and 65,000 different people in attendance on Sundays? Did you know that Bethlehem once had more millionaires per capita than any other part of America? Thank you, Walter. I think they caught the metaphor. So Walter just kind of called me out on this, but am I getting my cities mixed up here? Or maybe, am I onto something? Samuel journeys through Bethlehem and he meets a man named Jesse. Samuel is in Bethlehem to find the one who will replace Saul as king of Israel. And God has told him, find this man Jesse, for one of his sons will be king. The first sons that Samuel sees, Eliab and Abinadab and Shema and their brothers, seem to look the part. Samuel seems to notice this. They are tall, they are strong. I imagine they must have projected that innate sense of confidence and self-possession. They look like a king should look, don't they? Which makes it all the more surprising for Samuel to hear from God that these are not the people. These are not the ones, that God needs Samuel to look elsewhere. And it's right at the end of this exchange, right at the end of this moment, when all 7 of Samuel's sons have paraded past, of Jesse's sons have paraded past, that Jesse mentions that he has another boy, an 8th son, off tending sheep. We don't know what the brothers were doing when Samuel came into town. We do know what this youngest son, this shepherd boy, was doing. He was working. He was tending sheep. He was sweating in the heat of the day. He was putting wear into his sandals and furrows in his brow. And he was learning, and he was growing, and he was seeing new things and being shaped into the man that he would eventually become. You see, as a shepherd, this boy knew how to manage unruly subjects. He knew how to lead a team and how to work within a team. He knew how to be vigilant for danger. And he knew, as the world will soon discover, that sometimes being a leader means putting a stone in your sling and going out alone by yourself to protect your flock and your people, not because you love violence, but because sometimes tending a flock means fighting off a wolf. Is that a shepherd or is that a king? You tell me. This is the one whom God will choose to rule over Israel. And if Samuel had stayed in his grief for Saul, Samuel would have missed that completely. What God saw and what Samuel would eventually learn to see is that that shepherd boy named David was exactly the leader whom Israel needed to lead it forward into a future greater than anything any of them had ever seen before. David was far from a perfect king. He made his mistakes. He was human. But it's not by accident that almost 1,000 years later, when the Gospels speak of a new king, they will repeatedly remind us that this new king, this Jesus Christ, was born in Bethlehem, that he came from the line of Jesse, and that he was known to all the world as a shepherd. How long will you mourn for Saul? God asks Samuel, since I have rejected him as king over Israel. We might ask ourselves the same question. How long will you mourn for your Saul, for your treasured past, your incomplete dream? How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Will we allow ourselves to slip into the trap of fixating on the good old days? Or will we allow ourselves to look outward, to look at the world, and to see that even now God is moving? That even now there are Davids in our midst, here and there and all around us, even now, even today. May we stay in the present moment. May we stay where we are, and may we remember that though we might not always want to see it, any day can be a day of new beginnings if we open our hearts to the possibility. And that God's plans are unfolding all around us through unexpected people who are following their call to do their holy work. Amen.